So it's really interesting, isn't it, that actually what we saw in the 80s and 90s, where we saw the clinical trials in which women were hideously unrepresented. And there were big gender differences in lots of aspects of medicine. I mean, heart disease is a classic. So I don't know whether you feel this, but maybe it's come for a kind of a movement similar to that insisted on having women in trials, that we now have proper representation in trials. Let's take your question. Tell us who you are. Yeah, I'm going to have to shout.
Hi, I'm Lillian Hunt. I'm at Wellcome Trust, so I've seen the Wellcome Trust monitor data, which is really interesting. And shocking that it's still not changed, actually, with the most recent data that's come through. In terms of having people who look similar being a great factor in terms of trust relationships when you go into these groups, obviously you're limited then by the researchers themselves and what backgrounds they're from as well. So you end up in this sort of cycle of you have enough researchers from different ethnic minority groups, so therefore how do we reach that trust barrier with different ethnic minority groups as well? So what sort of way could we incentivise both those things to happen at the same time, or even change the way we're training so that we can cover those boundaries a little bit better maybe? Just some thoughts.
So I think that's really interesting. So I know that there are 55,000 clinical scientists in the NHS. Anybody a clinical scientist here? Hello. Hello. And we know that there's a very poor representation across the demographics, particularly in London, where we are not seeing similar demographics in clinical scientists to the population, and particularly African and Caribbean origin. We are seeing a lot of, and again, people think of ethnic minorities as somehow a homogeneous kind of, but it's not like that at all, and that's a problem. But we are seeing a really poor uptake of sciences and people entering those careers. So I know the Chief Scientific Officer, Sue Hill, has done a lot of work with a program called Reach Out to try and get those kids to get into the healthcare sciences field, because that would be enormously helpful. So I think it starts very young.
Yeah. What we've had to do is we've had to employ and take on board people from different groups just so that this works. But I think it's a journey, and this is the first step of the journey, and where we start building relationships with the community and build up understanding, then hopefully we'll move away from that position where we perceive there's a need, that they want somebody similar to them. And I think another way to do it would be for a Caucasian person to maybe engage with community leaders and use them as a way into those groups.
Anybody got any experience of this? David?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the volunteers, but I think you really have to look at the researchers, and you have to be telling them that they must recruit from these communities, and you have to pay them to do it.
Yeah.
At the moment, you have a risk score for breast cancer. It was the news 2 weeks ago. It's going to be piloted in British GP surgeries, partly genetic, partly other factors, and that will only work on white people. It's based on 500,000 people from the British Biobank, excluding anybody who's not white. So,
which is outrageous.
Which is completely outrageous, and people like the Wellcome and the MRC need to see that these tests are being developed and they will only work on white people, and people like the Wellcome and the MRC have to be paying scientists to go and get the samples you need to produce these tests that are useful.
Well, so in another life, I'm on the board of UKRI. So UKRI, the body which is the overarching body for all the research councils, and we are producing a new equality and inclusion strategy, and I think actually that ought to be part of that strategy. So please write to me formally.
Fine.
There you are. There's a done deal.